Now, there is something very interesting that you tweeted recently, and I took a screenshot of it. For me, a great story isn't about plot, it's about the characters, peeling back the tops of their heads, rooting around in their psyches, finding the emotional core, the psychological truth. The plot will form around that. Without the core, all plot in the world won't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I write from the character out. Sometimes a great plot idea will come, but even if you have the greatest plot idea in the world, we as an audience want to go on a journey with people that we know and can relate to. And especially with these characters that have been around forever, if you want to make them interesting, the only way to make them interesting is to dig into their heads and find things in there. I always, like I said, I imagine it's like you peel back their heads, you get a flashlight, you start looking, oh, no one's ever talked about that part of their psyche before, and find new things to say so that we can relate to them as real three-dimensional people. And once the reader or the writer hooks into that character in an emotional way, we'll go on any journey in the world with them. If we're not hooked into those characters, if we can't relate to those characters, I don't care how amazing your story is. It may entertain me for a few minutes, but I'm not going to come back month after month or week after week on a TV show or whatever it may be, unless those characters are real and mean something to me and reflect some truth of my own psyche.
Okay. How much classic literature actually shaped this approach of yours? Because Kraven's Last Hunt, a wonderful story, is borrowing a great deal of influence from Dostoevsky.
Yeah, Dostoevsky I discovered in high school. So I was always, I wasn't just reading comic books. I was reading everything in sight. I was reading science fiction. I was reading, if in school I got turned on to Dickens and Dostoevsky or whatever great literature we're reading.
Right.
I just loved reading, and I just loved story. And when I discovered Dostoevsky when I was in high school, we read Crime and Punishment, and that affected me like no other book I had ever read before, I don't think. And then my teacher knew how much I had loved that, and he handed me a copy of the Brothers Karamazov one day and said, "Here, go home and read this." Right. And that just, my head just exploded, And what we respond to in art are the things that are truths inside us. So I was always fascinated by and kind of tormented by the fact that, we're all filled with opposites. We're not just one, kind of what we were saying when we were talking about Shooter or about any of us. We're not just one thing or another. We all have opposites. We all have that pull of opposites. And sometimes that pull is very painful, in ourselves and when we see it in other people, who's someone's one way, then they're another, because we're very complex. And Dostoevsky always addressed that so profoundly and so deeply. And I responded to that. And I think as a kid, when you're growing up in the world and you're looking at the adults around you, they're just like what we're talking about. Some of the adults in your world are capable of incredible love and kindness, and other adults in your world may be capable of some very dark, unpleasant things. So you want to understand them, and you want to understand their psyches. And I took, none of this was conscious, but I took all that with me as a writer. So when you look at these so-called villains in comics, it's the same thing. And I've said many times that I think writing the villains is a great exercise in compassion, because you have to look at someone who's allegedly, quote, bad, right, and really look into their mind and their heart and understand what made them that way. And the minute you understand them, you can't hate them. You may still oppose what they stand for, but you can't hate them. In fact, you will have compassion for them. So, writing these kind of characters becomes an exercise in compassion that I think, and reading about them, I think, is an exercise in compassion that I hope we could take out into our lives when we look at other people. The world is so polarized, good, bad, up, down. We don't like them, we hate them, blah, blah, blah. But all those people are people. And what can we do, even if we oppose what they stand for, to understand them, and maybe in that understanding open up some doorway between them? So with Kraven, who is this character? Why does he run around in these leopard skin pants trying to kill Spider-Man?
Right.
What's in his head? And the thing that hooked me was I never really liked Kraven. I never thought he was that much of an interesting character. But in the Marvel Universe handbook, someone, I don't know whether it was ever in a story or someone just made it up while they were filling out the page, they said that Kraven was Russian.
Yes.
So Kraven's Russian. And all of a sudden the Dostoevsky part of my brain goes, oh, I totally know who this guy is. And off I went, and the whole story just went, you know.
I have to admit that my view about Kraven was mainly formed because I was introduced to Kraven the Hunter from the 1981 Spider-Man animated series, not with the comics. Comics came afterwards. And the animated series was just like you were alluding to, that we have this thing that, okay, there's this good and there's this bad. Kraven was a bad guy. But this book is like my favorite reading companion. Anytime I'm just, looking to read something that makes me realize that why shouldn't we not be judgmental towards others? No matter how bad a person is, we have to always keep ourselves in check. Another thing is that your work on Spider-Man was, I read the most. And I realized that you had the best exercise when it came to exploring the emotional side, not only of the villain, but also the hero himself.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong to say that you had a special connection with Spider-Man and Spider-Verse when it came about?
Yeah, no, you're right. What I was saying before with Captain America, there's you as a reader enjoying these characters, and there's you as a writer. Now, I always liked Spider-Man. I always enjoyed and read Spider-Man, but writing Peter Parker, something else happened. There becomes a connection between the writer and the character. It's almost like a mind meld. I pour all of myself into Peter. I take Peter into me, and this third entity shows up, which is my version of Peter Parker.
Right.
And I've said this many times before. In some ways, I know Peter Parker and Ben Reilly better than I know some of my friends, because I know everything that's going on in their heads. It's a very intimate connection. I really don't think of them as fictional characters. I think of them as real people. And you have to think of them as real people when you write these stories. You have to invest them with all the reality that you have to be shameless as a writer. You have to say things in your stories and through your characters that maybe you would never say to your best friend, but you can express it through the stories. And there was absolutely a mind meld with Peter, and I understood that character and loved that character, and still do to this day. And Ben Reilly as well. I just recently did this Ben Reilly Spider-Man series. It came out, I think the collected edition came out in early July, and writing Ben again after all these years was like a reunion with one of my oldest and dearest friends.
How painful was it for you to write Best of Enemies? Emotional.
Painful. It was, it was, I don't know if I'd say it was painful, but it was certainly emotional, because the whole story ran on emotion. But from a writing point of view, from a storytelling point of view,
yeah,
it was the best story to tell, because we did that really over 2 years, the whole Harry Peter story. And so what better story to tell from a storytelling point of view than the story of two best friends who are also mortal enemies? So they're trying on one level to destroy each other, but the whole time they still love each other and need each other. Talk about the perfect formula for drama, so that story, you just follow the characters and it wrote itself. It was, I loved working with an artist like Sal Buscema. Oh my God. Just like working with Mike Zeck on Kraven's Last Hunt. Doesn't get better than that. Just doesn't get better.
To me, it felt like almost a Shakespearean kind of a story when I read Best of Enemies. And
yeah, very, very high drama. Very high drama.
Very high drama. But equally, you weren't done with that, because I think as a reader, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not saying it's presenting it as a fact. But the most heartbreaking story for me was The Amazing Spider-Man number 400.
Yeah, the death of Aunt May. That was a tough one. That was a very emotional story to write. Very emotional. And I'm glad that it's a story that has held up and lasted all these years. Another one of the great moments of my career was when that story came out. I came home one day and I turned on my answering machine, and there was a message from John Romita Sr., who was my favorite Spider-Man artist, saying that he had read that story and that it brought him to tears. So it doesn't get better than that. It really doesn't get better than that. And Mark Bagley did such a beautiful job on that story too. I'm very lucky that throughout my career, I have worked with some of the most extraordinary artists out there.
I just wanted to say that thank you for sharing this story of John Romita Sr. actually leaving a message, because for me, it feels like I wasn't the only one who was very depressed when I read The Amazing Spider-Man number 400.
A lot of people, I go to conventions, and people will say, oh, my grandmother died around the same time that I read that story, or I lost my parent, and it really resonated with them. It's a universal thing. We're all, the minute you're alive, you're thinking about death and loss. And so those stories have a lot of impact for people if you do it right, if you don't do it in a cheap way. And the last thing we wanted to do with Aunt May's death was do it in a cheap way. I wanted it to be a story that had a real emotional reality, because it certainly affected me writing it. And I'm glad to hear that it affected the people that read it too.
If you are still in touch with Mr. Mark Bagley, please tell him that the last panel where Aunt May finally dies and Peter is hugging her and crying, I still feel emotional describing it.
It was a beautiful page. Yeah, Peter's like laying his head on her too. Yeah.
It's possibly like I don't know, maybe like the second biggest panel moment since the death of Gwen Stacy, in my opinion.
Yeah, that was very, very special story, and Mark did a beautiful, beautiful job with it.